Captain Sarah Martinez had always been different from the other pilots at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base. While her male counterparts gathered around the flight simulator talking about their weekend conquests, Sarah spent her free time studying aircraft manuals and maintenance procedures. She had earned her wings flying cargo planes and transport helicopters, but deep in her heart, she dreamed of something more dangerous, more thrilling. The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the tarmac as Sarah walked across the airfield, her flight suit clinging to her small frame. At 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighing barely 120 pounds, she looked nothing like the typical fighter pilot. The other airmen often joked that she could use the ejection seat as a regular chair, but Sarah had learned to ignore their comments. She had something they didn't have, an unwavering determination and a natural instinct for flying that couldn't be taught. General Robert Iron Eagle Harrison was a legend in the Air Force. At 58 years old, he had flown combat missions in 3 different wars and had more flight hours than most pilots could dream of accumulating in a lifetime. His weathered face told stories of dogfights over enemy territory, and his steely gray eyes had seen things that would break lesser men. He was known throughout the military for his no-nonsense attitude and his ability to spot talent from miles away. That Tuesday morning started like any other. Sarah was completing her pre-flight checks on AC-130 transport plane when she noticed a crowd gathering near the hangar. General Harrison had arrived for his monthly inspection, and as usual, he was making his rounds with his characteristic blend of authority and intimidation. Sarah tried to focus on her checklist, but she couldn't help stealing glances at the legendary officer as he moved through the facility. The general's voice carried across the hangar as he spoke with Colonel James Mitchell, the base commander. They were standing next to a row of A-10 Thunderbolt II aircraft, also known as Warthogs. These were the tank busters, the close air support specialists that could take a beating and keep flying. Sarah had always been fascinated by these ugly, but effective aircraft. They weren't pretty like the F-16s or sleek like the F-22s, but they were built to survive and delivered devastating firepower to support ground troops. These machines are the backbone of our close air support operations, General Harrison was saying to a group of young officers who had gathered around him. Flying an A-10 isn't about looking good or going fast. It's about having the guts to fly low and slow into hell itself, delivering precision strikes while taking enemy fire. It takes a special kind of pilot to handle one of these birds. Sarah found herself drawn closer to the group, her curiosity getting the better of her. She had read everything she could find about the A-10, from its development history to its combat record. She knew that the aircraft was built around its massive 30mm Gu-8 cannon, which could fire depleted uranium rounds capable of penetrating tank armor. She understood the aircraft's unusual design, with its engines mounted high on the fuselage to protect them from ground fire, and its titanium armor bathtub that surrounded the pilot. As she moved closer, Sarah accidentally bumped into Lieutenant Tom Rodriguez, one of the A-10 pilots. "Sorry," she whispered, trying to maintain her composure. But the brief contact was enough to catch General Harrison's attention. "And who might this be?" the general asked, his piercing gaze falling on Sarah. The entire group turned to look at her, and she felt her cheeks burning with embarrassment. "Captain Sarah Martinez, sir," she replied, snapping to attention and delivering a crisp salute. "Transport pilot, sir." General Harrison studied her for a moment, his eyes taking in her small stature and youthful appearance. Sarah was only 26 years old, but she had been flying for the Air Force for 5 years and had accumulated over 1,200 flight hours in various aircraft. "Transport pilot," the general repeated slowly. "What kind of aircraft do you fly, Captain Martinez?" "Primarily C-130s, sir. Also qualified on C-17s and various helicopter platforms, including the UH-60 and CH-47. The general nodded approvingly. Multi-engine experience was always valuable, and helicopter time showed versatility. But Sarah could see something else in his expression, a hint of amusement, as if he found her presence among the combat pilots somehow entertaining. "Tell me, Captain," the general continued, "what do you think about these A-10s?" Sarah felt the weight of everyone's attention on her. She could have given a safe, standard answer about the aircraft's reputation and service record. Instead, she decided to speak from her heart. "I think they're incredible machines, sir. The Gu-8 cannon is mounted slightly off-center because of its size, which requires specific techniques to manage the aircraft's balance during firing. The redundant hydraulic systems and manual backup flight controls mean the aircraft can survive damage that would down any other plane. The pilot sits in a titanium bathtub that can stop 23mm cannon shells, and the whole aircraft is designed around the philosophy of survivability over speed or aesthetics." The general's eyebrows rose slightly. This young transport pilot clearly knew more about the A-10 than he had expected. Several of the actual A-10 pilots in the group looked surprised as well. "That's quite impressive knowledge for someone who flies cargo planes," General Harrison said. "Have you ever been up close to one of these aircraft before?" "No, sir. I've only studied them from afar. But I've read every technical manual, combat report, and pilot interview I could get my hands on. The A-10 has always fascinated me." Lieutenant Rodriguez snorted slightly. "Studying and flying are two very different things, Captain. These birds aren't like your transports. They're combat aircraft that require split-second decisions and nerves of steel." Sarah felt a flash of irritation at the dismissive tone, but she kept her voice level. "I understand that, Lieutenant. I wasn't suggesting otherwise." General Harrison watched this exchange with interest. He had spent decades in the military, and he had developed a sixth sense for recognizing potential in unexpected places. Something about this young woman's confidence and knowledge intrigued him. "Captain Martinez," the general said suddenly, "have you ever wanted to fly combat aircraft?" The question caught Sarah off guard. She had dreamed about it countless times, but she had never been given the opportunity to pursue fighter training. The Air Force had needed transport pilots when she graduated from flight school, and that's where she had been assigned. "Yes, sir, I have," she answered honestly. "Even something as challenging as the A-10?" "Especially the A-10, sir." The general studied her for a long moment, and Sarah could see the wheels turning in his mind. Around them, the other pilots shifted uncomfortably. They weren't sure where this conversation was heading, but they could sense that something significant was about to happen. "You know, Captain," the general said slowly, "I've heard a lot of pilots talk about how much they know about various aircraft. Most of the time, it's just talk. Book knowledge is one thing, but actually handling a combat aircraft is something entirely different." Sarah nodded, unsure of where he was going with this. "The A-10 is particularly challenging because it doesn't fly like other aircraft. It's heavy, it's slow, and it requires a very specific set of skills to operate effectively. Most pilots who transition to the A-10 struggle for months to master its unique characteristics." "I understand, sir." General Harrison glanced around at the group of pilots, then back at Sarah. A slight smile played at the corners of his mouth. Not a friendly smile, but the kind of smile a predator might wear before pouncing on its prey. "I'll tell you what, Captain Martinez. Since you seem to know so much about the A-10, why don't you prove it? I dare you to take one of these birds up for a flight." The words hung in the air like a challenge thrown down at a medieval tournament. Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. Around her, the other pilots exchanged glances of disbelief. General Harrison had just suggested that a transport pilot with no combat aircraft experience should fly one of the most complex close air support aircraft in the world. "Sir," Sarah managed to say, uncertain if she had heard correctly. "You heard me, Captain. You claim to know these aircraft inside and out. You say you've studied every manual and report. Well, here's your chance to put that knowledge to the test. Take an A-10 up for a 30-minute flight. Show me that all that studying actually means something." Colonel Mitchell stepped forward, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken. "General, sir, with all due respect, Captain Martinez isn't qualified on the A-10. She hasn't been through the training program, or I'm aware of that, Colonel, General Harrison interrupted. That's what makes this interesting. Either Captain Martinez really knows these aircraft as well as she claims, or she doesn't. There's only one way to find out. Sarah's mind raced. This was completely unprecedented. Military pilots didn't just jump into unfamiliar aircraft, especially complex combat planes like the A-10. There were training programs, certification requirements, safety protocols. What the general was suggesting was not just unusual, it was potentially dangerous. But at the same time, this was the opportunity she had dreamed about her entire career. How many transport pilots ever got the chance to fly a combat aircraft? How many people got a direct challenge from a 3-star general? I'll need to review the specific procedures and run through the checklist, Sarah said carefully. And I want to verify that I'm covered by insurance and regulations if something goes wrong. General Harrison's smile widened. Captain Martinez, are you telling me you're actually considering this? Yes, sir. I am. The group of pilots erupted in murmurs of disbelief. Lieutenant Rodriguez shook his head. General, this is insane. She could kill herself or destroy a multi-million-dollar aircraft. The A-10 isn't a toy. Nobody said it was, Lieutenant, the general replied coolly. But I've been flying for 35 years, and I've learned to trust my instinct about pilots. Captain Martinez has something that can't be taught, genuine passion and deep knowledge. Sometimes that's more valuable than years of formal training. Colonel Mitchell looked like he wanted to object again, but he knew better than to argue with General Harrison when his mind was made up. The general had a reputation for unconventional decisions, and more often than not, those decisions proved to be correct. What are the terms? Sarah asked, surprised by her own boldness. Simple, General Harrison replied. 30-minute flight. Take off, perform some basic maneuvers, and land safely. If you can do that without embarrassing yourself or damaging the aircraft, I'll personally recommend you for combat aircraft training. If you can't, he shrugged. Well, at least you'll have learned something about the difference between theory and practice. Sarah felt the eyes of everyone around her. This was a crossroads moment that would define the rest of her career. She could play it safe, decline the challenge, and continue flying transport planes for the rest of her military service. Or she could take the biggest risk of her life and try to prove that she belonged in the cockpit of a combat aircraft. When? She asked. Right now, General Harrison said. No point in giving you time to overthink it or develop second thoughts. Either you can fly this bird, or you can't. Sarah looked at the A-10 sitting nearby on the tarmac. It was painted in the standard gray camouflage scheme, with external fuel tanks and practice ammunition loaded on its weapon pylons. The aircraft looked exactly like the picture she had studied for years, but seeing it up close made her realize just how big and intimidating it really was. I'll need 15 minutes to review the emergency procedures and familiarize myself with the cockpit layout, she said. Fair enough, the general agreed. Lieutenant Rodriguez, escort Captain Martinez to aircraft 81, 0965, and help her with the pre-flight inspection. I want this done by the book, no shortcuts, and no compromises on safety. As Sarah walked toward the A-10, her heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and terror, she couldn't help but wonder what she was getting herself into. She had spent years dreaming of this moment, but now that it was actually happening, the reality was more overwhelming than she had ever imagined. Behind her, she could hear the other pilots talking in low, worried voices. Most of them thought she was about to make a fool of herself or worse. But Sarah had always been driven by a need to prove herself, and this challenge from General Harrison was the ultimate test of everything she claimed to know about flying. As she climbed up to the A-10's cockpit for the first time, Sarah Martinez had no idea that she was about to become part of Air Force legend. The cockpit of the A-10 Thunderbolt II was unlike anything Sarah had ever seen. As she settled into the ejection seat, she was struck by how different it felt from the spacious cockpits of the transport aircraft she was accustomed to flying. Everything was compact, purposeful, and designed for combat efficiency rather than comfort. The instrument panel stretched out before her like a complex puzzle, filled with switches, gauges, and displays that controlled one of the most formidable weapons systems ever created. Lieutenant Rodriguez stood on the crew ladder beside the aircraft, watching Sarah with a mixture of concern and curiosity. Despite his earlier skepticism, he had to admit that she seemed remarkably calm for someone about to attempt something so far outside her normal duties. He had seen experienced fighter pilots break out in nervous sweats during their first A-10 flights, but Captain Martinez appeared focused and methodical as she examined each control and display. "The throttles are here on your left," Rodriguez explained, pointing to the twin levers. "Unlike single-engine fighters, you've got two TF-34 turbofans to manage. They're not the most powerful engines in the Air Force inventory, but they're reliable and fuel-efficient. The most important thing to remember is that these engines have a significant spool-up time. When you need power, you need to anticipate it well in advance." Sarah nodded, her hands moving over the throttle quadrant as she familiarized herself with the positions. She had read about the A-10's engine characteristics, but feeling the actual controls under her fingers was different from studying diagrams. The throttles felt solid and precise, with clearly defined detents for different power settings. "The flight controls are fully manual backup capable," Rodriguez continued. "You've got hydraulic boost under normal conditions, but if you lose hydraulic pressure, you can still fly this bird using pure muscle power. It won't be easy, but it's possible. The stick forces will be heavy, but the aircraft will respond." Sarah gripped the control stick, noting its position and feel. The A-10's flight controls were legendary for their simplicity and reliability. Unlike modern fly-by-wire fighters that use computers to interpret pilot inputs, the Warthog provided direct mechanical linkage between the pilot's hands and the aircraft's control surfaces. It was old-school flying at its finest. "Now, this is the most important part," Rodriguez said, his voice becoming more serious. "The GU-8 cannon system." He pointed to a series of switches and indicators on the right side of the cockpit. "Under no circumstances should you attempt to fire the gun during this flight. The cannon is loaded with training rounds, but the recoil from the GU-8 is unlike anything else in aviation. It actually slows the aircraft down when fired, and the muzzle flash can be blinding. Even experienced A-10 pilots need extensive training before they're allowed to use the gun." "Understood," Sarah replied. "I have no intention of firing any weapons today. This is strictly a handling and flying exercise." As Rodriguez continued his explanation of the various systems, Sarah found herself amazed by the level of redundancy built into the A-10. There were backup systems for the backup systems. The aircraft had been designed by engineers who understood that it would be flying low and slow over enemy territory, taking damage that would destroy other aircraft. Every critical system had multiple ways to keep functioning even under combat conditions. General Harrison approached the aircraft, followed by Colonel Mitchell and a small group of other officers. Word of the unusual challenge had spread quickly around the base, and people were gathering to witness what many expected to be either a triumph or a disaster. "How are we doing, Captain?" the general called up to the cockpit. "Systems check complete, sir," Sarah replied. "I'm ready to proceed with engine start procedures." "Very good. Remember, this is a training flight, not a combat mission. Keep it simple, keep it safe, and show me what you can do." Sarah nodded and began the engine start sequence she had memorized from the technical manuals. The procedure was more complex than starting the single turboprop engine she was used to, but her transport experience with multi-engine aircraft helped her manage the process systematically. She worked through each step carefully, monitoring engine parameters and ensuring that both turbofans spooled up normally. As the engines reached idle power, Sarah felt the familiar vibration of aircraft ready to fly. But the A-10's engines produced a different sound from what she was accustomed to, a deeper, more powerful rumble that spoke of serious capability. The aircraft seemed eager to leave the ground, like a caged predator ready to hunt. Davis Monthan Tower, This is Hog 77 requesting taxi clearance for a local training flight. Sarah transmitted over the radio. Her voice was steady and professional, giving no hint of the butterflies dancing in her stomach. Hog 77, taxi to runway 21 via taxiway Alpha. Winds 240 at 8 knots, altimeter 3008. Sarah released the parking brake and gently advanced the throttles. The A-10 began to move, and immediately she noticed how different it felt from her usual aircraft. The Warthog was heavy, much heavier than it looked. At maximum gross weight, an A-10 could weigh over 50,000 pounds, and even this relatively light training configuration was substantially heavier than the helicopters and light transport planes she normally flew. The aircraft steering was accomplished through differential braking and rudder inputs, similar to what Sarah was familiar with, but the A-10's wide-track landing gear gave it a very stable feel on the ground. As she taxied toward the runway, she could see people standing around the flight line, watching her progress. Some were taking pictures, others were shaking their heads in disbelief. During the taxi, Sarah ran through her mental checklist one more time. She reviewed the emergency procedures, the performance numbers, and the handling characteristics she had studied. She thought about weight and balance, about the aircraft's center of gravity, about how the controls would feel at different airspeeds. All of her theoretical knowledge was about to be put to the ultimate test. As she approached the runway, Sarah performed the standard pre-takeoff checks. Flight controls, free and correct. Engine parameters, normal. Warning lights, all out. She set the trim for takeoff and verified that the aircraft was properly configured for flight. Hog 77, you're cleared for takeoff runway 21. Contact departure on 124.9 after airborne. This was the moment of truth. Sarah aligned the A-10 with the runway center line and slowly advanced both throttles to takeoff power. The engines responded with a surge of thrust, and the aircraft began accelerating down the runway. The acceleration was steady rather than dramatic. The A-10 was not built for speed, but for persistence and survivability. As the airspeed indicator climbed through 60 knots, Sarah could feel the flight controls becoming more responsive. The aircraft wanted to fly, and she could sense its eagerness through the control stick. At 120 knots, she applied gentle back pressure, and the A-10 lifted off the runway with surprising grace for such a large, ungainly-looking machine. The moment the aircraft left the ground, Sarah felt a rush of exhilaration unlike anything she had ever experienced. This was not the gentle, predictable flight characteristics of a transport plane or helicopter. This was a combat aircraft built for war, and it flew with a purposeful intensity that was both thrilling and intimidating. As she climbed away from the airfield, Sarah marveled at how solid and stable the A-10 felt. The aircraft tracked straight and true, requiring minimal control inputs to maintain its heading and attitude. The engines provided smooth, reliable power, and all the systems functioned exactly as the manuals had described. At 5,000 feet above ground level, Sarah leveled off and began exploring the A-10's flight envelope. She started with gentle turns, gradually increasing the bank angle to get a feel for how the aircraft responded to control inputs. The A-10 turned predictably and smoothly, without any of the quirks or surprises that might catch an inexperienced pilot off guard. Down on the ground, General Harrison and the assembled crowd watched the aircraft's progress on radar and through binoculars. The general stood with his arms crossed, studying Sarah's flight path and maneuvers with the eye of someone who had spent decades evaluating pilot performance. "She's doing well," Colonel Mitchell admitted grudgingly. "Clean takeoff, good climb profile, and her turns look coordinated and controlled." "It's early yet," Lieutenant Rodriguez said. "The real test will be when she tries more complex maneuvers or when she has to deal with the landing approach. The A-10 can be tricky in the pattern, especially for someone who's not used to managing the energy state of a heavier aircraft." General Harrison remained silent, but his experienced eye could see that Captain Martinez was flying the A-10 with confidence and skill. Her flight path was smooth and purposeful, without the erratic movements that typically characterized a pilot struggling with an unfamiliar aircraft. In the cockpit, Sarah was discovering that her years of studying the A-10 were paying off in ways she had never expected. Every control input produced exactly the response she had anticipated from reading the flight manuals. The aircraft's handling characteristics matched the descriptions she had memorized, and her theoretical knowledge was translating surprisingly well into practical flying skills. She decided to attempt a more challenging maneuver, a steep turn at 60 degrees of bank. This would test both her understanding of the aircraft's performance envelope and her ability to manage its energy state during aggressive maneuvering. Sarah rolled the A-10 into a left turn, steadily increasing the bank angle while adding power to maintain altitude. The aircraft responded beautifully, tracking around the turn with rock-solid stability. Sarah could feel the increased G-forces pressing her into the ejection seat, but the A-10 showed no signs of stress or instability. She held the turn for 360 degrees, then smoothly rolled back to wings-level flight. "Outstanding," she said to herself, surprised by how natural the maneuver had felt. Next, she decided to explore the A-10's slow-speed characteristics. This was one of the aircraft's most important attributes, its ability to fly slowly and maintain control while providing close air support to ground forces. Sarah gradually reduced power and allowed the airspeed to decrease, carefully monitoring the aircraft's response as it approached its minimum flying speed. The A-10's large, straight wings and powerful control surfaces allowed it to maintain excellent handling characteristics even at very low airspeeds. The aircraft gave clear warnings before approaching a stall condition, with gentle buffeting and predictable changes in control field that provided plenty of advance notice to the pilot. Sarah was beginning to understand why the A-10 had such a devoted following among pilots who had flown it. The aircraft was honest and straightforward, without any of the deceptive or dangerous characteristics that made some military aircraft difficult to fly. It was a pilot's airplane in the truest sense, responsive to good technique and forgiving of minor errors. As she continued her exploration of the A-10's capabilities, Sarah found herself thinking about the thousands of combat missions these aircraft had flown. She imagined pilots like herself flying low over enemy territory, providing life-saving close air support to soldiers on the ground. The thought gave her a deeper appreciation for the aircraft's design and mission. 20 minutes into the flight, Sarah decided it was time to begin her approach back to Davis-Monthan. She contacted the tower and received clearance to enter the traffic pattern for runway 21. This would be the most challenging part of the flight, managing the A-10's energy and configuration changes during the approach and landing. As she descended toward the traffic pattern altitude, Sarah began configuring the aircraft for landing. She extended the landing gear, feeling the aircraft's aerodynamics change as the gear doors opened and the wheels dropped into the slipstream. The A-10's gear system was robust and reliable, designed to operate from rough, unprepared airstrips if necessary. Next, she extended the flaps and adjusted the trim to compensate for the changing aerodynamic forces. The A-10's approach configuration was significantly different from its clean flight attitude, requiring careful attention to power settings and attitude to maintain a stable approach path. As Sarah turned onto the final approach, she could see the runway stretching out before her. The sight was both familiar and strange. She had landed on this same runway hundreds of times, but never in an aircraft like this. The A-10's approach speed was higher than what she was used to in transport aircraft, and the sight picture from the cockpit was different due to the aircraft's unique configuration. General Harrison and the crowd of observers moved to positions where they could watch the landing approach. This was the moment that would determine whether Captain Martinez's bold gamble would end in triumph or disaster. "She's looking good so far," Colonel Mitchell said, tracking the A-10's progress through his binoculars. "Airspeed looks stable. Approach angle appears correct." "The real test is about to begin," General Harrison replied. "Landing is where most pilots get into trouble with unfamiliar aircraft. Let's see what she's really made of." The final approach in the A-10 Thunderbolt II was unlike anything Sarah had ever experienced. As she descended toward runway 21, she found herself managing a complex dance of power, attitude, and configuration that required all of her concentration and skill. The aircraft was heavier than anything she had ever landed, and its momentum carried it forward with an authority that demanded respect and precise control inputs. At 500 feet above the ground, Sarah made her final configuration checks. Landing gear down and locked flaps extended, trim set for approach. The A-10's cockpit displays showed all systems functioning normally, and the twin-turbofan engines were providing steady, reliable thrust. But despite the aircraft's apparent cooperation, Sarah could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on her like a physical force. In the tower cab, the air traffic controllers watched her approach with professional interest mixed with concern. Word of the unusual flight had reached them, and they were well aware that they were watching a transport pilot attempt to land one of the Air Force's most challenging aircraft. The tower supervisor had quietly alerted the crash crew and emergency personnel, though he hoped their services wouldn't be needed. Hog 77, winds are 240 at 6 knots. Runway 21 cleared to land. The controller transmitted, his voice carefully neutral despite his private concerns. "Cleared to land runway 21. Hog 77, Sarah replied, her voice steady and professional. Inside the cockpit, however, her heart was racing as she made the subtle adjustments needed to maintain a stable approach path. The A-10's approach speed was significantly faster than what Sarah was accustomed to in her transport aircraft, where AC-130 might approach at 120 knots. The Warthog required 160 knots to maintain adequate control authority and safety margins. The higher speed meant less time to make corrections and a longer landing roll, both of which demanded precise technique and careful energy management. As she descended through 200 feet, Sarah could see the runway numbers growing larger in her windscreen. The sight picture was subtly different from her usual aircraft due to the A-10's unique configuration and cockpit position. She had to trust her instruments and her training, making small corrections to maintain the proper glide path while resisting the temptation to overthink the process. Down on the flight line, the crowd of observers had grown significantly. Word of Captain Martinez's flight had spread throughout the base, and people were abandoning their duties to witness what many considered either an act of incredible courage or complete madness. Maintenance crews, administrative personnel, and pilots from other squadrons had all gathered to watch the unprecedented landing attempt. General Harrison stood at the center of the group, his weathered face impassive as he tracked the A-10's progress through a pair of military-issued binoculars. Beside him, Colonel Mitchell shifted nervously from foot to foot, clearly uncomfortable with the risks involved in the impromptu test flight. "She's got the approach nailed," Lieutenant Rodriguez admitted grudgingly. Despite his earlier skepticism, he had to respect what he was seeing. Captain Martinez was flying a textbook approach, maintaining proper airspeed and descent rate, while keeping the aircraft perfectly aligned with the runway centerline. "It's not over until she's stopped on the ground," Colonel Mitchell replied tersely. "The A-10 can be tricky during the landing rollout. The nose gear is positioned differently from most aircraft, and the braking characteristics take some getting used to." General Harrison remained silent, but his experience, I could see the quality of Sarah's flying. The approach was smooth and controlled, without any of the erratic corrections or unstable flight path that would indicate a pilot struggling with an unfamiliar aircraft. Either Captain Martinez was incredibly lucky, or she possessed a natural flying ability that transcended normal training requirements. At 50 feet above the runway, Sarah began the final phase of the landing. She gradually reduced power while maintaining airspeed, preparing for the critical transition from flying aircraft to ground vehicle. The A-10's large, straight wings provided excellent lift characteristics at low speeds, but they also created significant float if the landing technique wasn't precise. The moment of touchdown came with surprising gentleness. Sarah's years of experience landing heavy transport aircraft had given her an instinctive feel for the proper landing attitude, and she touched down on the main landing gear with barely perceptible contact. A small puff of tire smoke marked the moment when theory became reality. Captain Sarah Martinez had successfully landed an A-10 Thunderbolt II on her first attempt. But the flight wasn't over yet. The landing rollout in a heavy aircraft like the A-10 required just as much skill and attention as the approach itself. Sarah lowered the nose wheel to the runway and began applying wheel brakes, feeling the aircraft's substantial momentum as it decelerated down the long runway. The A-10's anti-skid braking system worked flawlessly, providing maximum stopping power without locking the wheels. As the aircraft slowed through 60 knots, Sarah deployed the speed brakes to increase aerodynamic drag and shorten the landing roll. The A-10 responded immediately, and she could feel the deceleration increasing as the aircraft transformed from flying machine back to ground vehicle. Hog 77, nice landing. Contact ground control on 121.7 for taxi instructions. The tower controller transmitted, relief evident in his voice despite his professional demeanor. Contacting ground, Hog 77, Sarah replied. As she switched radio frequencies, she couldn't suppress a smile of satisfaction. She had done it. She had successfully flown and landed an A-10 Thunderbolt II without incident or embarrassment. The taxi back to the flight line felt like a victory lap. Sarah could see people lining the taxiways and ramps, watching her progress with expressions ranging from admiration to disbelief. She had just accomplished something that many career pilots would never have the opportunity to attempt, and she had done it with skill and professionalism that impressed even her harshest critics. As she approached the parking area where General Harrison and the others were waiting, Sarah began the shutdown procedures. She reduced power to ground idle, set the parking brake, and began the systematic process of securing the aircraft systems. Each switch position and checklist item represented another step in the completion of what had been an extraordinary flight. When the engines finally spooled down to silence, Sarah sat in the cockpit for a moment, absorbing what had just happened. 30 minutes earlier, she had been a transport pilot with dreams of flying combat aircraft. Now she was a transport pilot who had actually done it, who had proven that determination and knowledge could overcome conventional barriers and expectations. The crew ladder appeared beside the cockpit, and Lieutenant Rodriguez climbed up to assist with her post-flight procedures. His expression had changed completely from the skeptical dismissal he had shown earlier. Now he looked at her with something approaching respect. "That was some damn fine flying, Captain," he said simply. "I've seen A-10 pilots with hundreds of hours in the bird who couldn't have done better." Sarah climbed down from the cockpit on slightly unsteady legs, the adrenaline of the flight finally catching up with her. As her feet touched the tarmac, she was immediately surrounded by the crowd of observers who had witnessed her flight. Their faces showed a mixture of admiration, surprise, and newfound respect. But the person she was most interested in seeing was General Harrison, who stood slightly apart from the crowd with his arms crossed and an unreadable expression on his weathered face. As Sarah approached him, the crowd fell silent, everyone waiting to hear the legendary officer's verdict on what they had just witnessed. "That was adequate," General Harrison said finally, his voice carrying the same authoritative tone he had used earlier. "Your approach was stable, your landing was acceptable, and you didn't damage my aircraft or embarrass the Air Force." Sarah felt a momentary disappointment at the lukewarm assessment, but then she caught the hint of a smile playing at the corners of the general's mouth. "However," he continued, "I've been evaluating pilots for over 30 years, and I can count on one hand the number of aviators I've seen who could have done what you just did. Flying an unfamiliar aircraft, especially a combat aircraft, requires more than just technical knowledge. It requires instinct, judgment, and the kind of natural flying ability that can't be taught in any training program. The crowd stirred with murmurs of agreement and appreciation. Colonel Mitchell stepped forward, his earlier concerns replaced by genuine admiration for what he had witnessed. "Captain Martinez," the general continued, "I made you a promise earlier. If you could fly that aircraft without embarrassing yourself, I would personally recommend you for combat aircraft training. Consider that promise kept." Sarah felt her knees go weak with relief and excitement. This was the opportunity she had dreamed of for her entire career, the chance to transition from transport operations to the combat aviation community that had always seemed beyond her reach. "But I have a confession to make," General Harrison added, his smile becoming more pronounced. "This wasn't entirely a spur-of-the-moment decision on my part. I've been watching your record for some time, Captain Martinez. Your performance in transport operations has been exceptional, and your test scores and evaluations have consistently placed you in the top percentile of Air Force pilots." Sarah looked at him in surprise. She had no idea that her performance had attracted attention at such high levels. "The truth is, I came to Davis-Monthan today specifically to meet you. Your squadron commander has been recommending you for advanced training for over a year, but the bureaucracy has been slow to respond. Sometimes it takes a dramatic demonstration to cut through the red tape and make things happen." The revelation that this had been at least partially planned made Sarah feel a mixture of relief and slight manipulation, but she couldn't argue with the results. She had just proven her capabilities in the most dramatic way possible, and she had earned the respect of everyone who witnessed her flight. However, General Harrison continued, his tone becoming more serious. "What you did today was just the beginning. If you're serious about transitioning to combat aircraft, you'll face months of intensive training that will challenge everything you think you know about flying. The A-10 may have been forgiving today, but combat aviation is unforgiving of mistakes or inadequate preparation." "I understand, sir," Sarah replied. "I'm ready for whatever training is required." "We'll see about that," the general said. "Report to Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada next Monday. You'll begin the A-10 transition course immediately. If you successfully complete the program, you'll be assigned to a combat squadron where you'll have the opportunity to put your skills to real use." As the crowd began to disperse and the excitement of the moment started to fade, Sarah found herself thinking about what came next. She had achieved her immediate goal of proving herself capable of flying combat aircraft, but now she faced the much greater challenge of actually becoming a combat pilot through proper training and certification. The A-10 sat silent on the ramp behind her, its gray camouflage paint and battle-scarred appearance a reminder of the serious nature of the career path she was about to embark upon. This aircraft and others like it had flown thousands of combat missions, providing close air support to soldiers in harm's way and returning home with battle damage that would have destroyed lesser machines. Soon, if she proved herself worthy, Sarah Martinez would be joining the ranks of pilots who flew these missions, carrying forward a tradition of courage and skill that stretched back to the earliest days of military aviation. But first, she had to survive the training that would transform her from a competent transport pilot into a fully qualified A-10 combat aviator. As she walked away from the aircraft that had changed her life, Sarah carried with her the confidence that came from successfully meeting the ultimate challenge. She had dared to dream beyond the limitations others had placed on her, and she had proven that determination and skill could overcome any barrier. 6 months later, Captain Sarah Martinez sat in the cockpit of her assigned 10th Thunderbolt II at Bagram Airfield in Afghanistan, preparing for her first combat mission. The aircraft around her bore the scars and patches of previous battles, bullet holes that had been repaired with metal plates, paint worn away by desert sand and enemy fire, and the weathered appearance that came from months of hard use in one of the world's most challenging environments. The transformation from transport pilot to combat aviator had been more difficult than Sarah had ever imagined. The training at Nellis Air Force Base had pushed her to the limits of her physical and mental capabilities, forcing her to master not just the technical aspects of flying the A-10, but the complex skills required for close air support, target identification, and combat decision-making under extreme stress. Her instructors had been merciless in their demands for perfection. Every flight had been an examination, every maneuver scrutinized for flaws that could prove fatal in combat. She had learned to fire the massive GU-8 cannon, feeling the aircraft shudder and slow under the tremendous recoil forces. She had practiced dropping bombs with precision that could mean the difference between saving friendly forces and causing catastrophic friendly fire incidents. The academic portion of the training had been equally challenging. Sarah had studied enemy tactics, weapons systems, and the complex rules of engagement that govern modern warfare. She had memorized radio procedures, learned to interpret intelligence reports, and practiced coordinating with ground controllers who would guide her attacks against enemy positions. Most importantly, she had learned the awesome responsibility that came with flying close air support missions. Unlike strategic bombers that attacked distant targets, A-10 pilots flew low and close to friendly forces, often within a few hundred meters of soldiers who were depending on them for survival. A single mistake, a momentary lapse in judgment, could result in the deaths of the very people she was trying to protect. Now, as she completed her pre-flight checks in the harsh environment of a combat zone, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The dare from General Harrison had been just the beginning, a dramatic demonstration that had opened doors, but the real work had come in the months of intensive training that followed. Her flight leader, Major Jessica Reaper Thompson, was a veteran A-10 pilot with over 200 combat missions to her credit. Major Thompson had been initially skeptical of the new pilot who had arrived with such an unusual background story, but Sarah's performance during training and her first weeks in Afghanistan had quickly earned the respect of her squadron mates. Hog 2-1, this is Reaper. Major Thompson's voice crackled through Sarah's headset. Radio check and status report. Reaper, Hog 2-1, loud and clear. Aircraft systems normal, weapons hot, ready for mission tasking, Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. Today's mission would take them to the Helmand province, where a Marine infantry unit was pinned down by Taliban fighters in fortified positions. The ground forces had been under fire for over 6 hours, and conventional artillery support was ineffective against the enemy's well-concealed bunkers. The Marines needed the precision firepower that only the A-10 could provide. As Sarah taxied her aircraft toward the runway, she thought about the soldiers who were counting on her success. She had never met them, didn't know their names or faces, but they were her responsibility now. Everything she had trained for, all the knowledge she had accumulated, and every skill she had developed would be focused on keeping those Marines alive and completing their mission. The takeoff from Bagram was routine, but as soon as they were airborne, Sarah could feel the difference between training flights and real combat operations. The radios were busy with military traffic, intelligence updates were constantly being transmitted, and there's an underlying tension that came from knowing that somewhere ahead of them, people were fighting for their lives. The flight to the target area took 45 minutes, during which Sarah and Major Thompson received detailed briefings from intelligence officers and ground controllers. The Taliban positions were well fortified and cleverly concealed, taking advantage of natural terrain features and civilian structures to hide from aerial observation. The Marines are taking fire from multiple positions, the ground controller explained over the radio. We've identified at least 3 separate machine gun nests and what appears to be a mortar position. The enemy is using a compound of buildings to mask their movements, and they've got excellent fields of fire covering the approaches our guys need to use. As they approached the target area, Sarah could see smoke rising from several locations where firefights were in progress. The landscape below looked peaceful from altitude, just another collection of mud brick buildings and agricultural fields that characterized rural Afghanistan. But She knew that deadly combat was taking place in those seemingly quiet villages. Hog-to-1, this is Widow 76, came the voice of the Marine ground controller. We've got Marines in contact, danger close. Need immediate close air support on multiple targets. How copy? Widow 76, Hog-to-1, good copy. We're two A-10s with mixed ordnance, playtime 4 hours. Ready for 9-line briefing. The 9-line briefing that followed was a standardized format that provided all the essential information needed for a close air support attack. Target location, friendly force positions, attack heading, elevation, target description, location of the controlling unit, and, most importantly, the minimum safe distance for friendly forces. Sarah listened intently as the ground controller provided the details, her mind automatically processing the information and beginning to formulate an attack plan. This was what all her training had been leading up to, the moment when theoretical knowledge would be applied in a life-or-death situation with real consequences for real people. Hog-to-1, I need you to take the machine gun position in the northeast corner of the compound, Major Thompson instructed. I'll handle the mortar team to the south. Watch your altitude. There are reports of small arms fire in the area, and we know they've got at least one heavy machine gun that can reach us. Sarah acknowledged the instructions and began her attack run, descending toward the target area with her heart pounding from a combination of adrenaline and intense concentration. Through her targeting pod, she could see the building that contained the enemy machine gun nest. It looked ordinary and unremarkable, just another mud brick structure in a rural Afghan village. But as she lined up for her attack, Sarah could see muzzle flashes from the building's windows, clear evidence of the enemy fighters inside who were firing at the Marines trapped below. Those flashes represented real bullets being fired at real soldiers, and it was her job to stop them. Hog-to-1, you're cleared hot, the ground controller transmitted. Friendlies are 200 meters to the southwest, marked by green smoke. Sarah could see the green smoke marking the Marine positions, and she carefully verified the distance between friendly forces and her target. The margin for error was terrifyingly small. A miscalculation of just a few meters could result in friendly casualties. She selected her 30mm cannon and began her attack run, diving toward the target building at an angle that would keep her clear of the friendly forces. The A-10's heads-up display showed her exactly where her bullets would impact, and she made final corrections to ensure accurate placement. At the optimal firing range, Sarah squeezed the trigger, sending a burst of depleted uranium rounds into the target building. The Gu-8 cannon fired with its characteristic roar, and Sarah felt the familiar deceleration as the massive gun's recoil slowed her aircraft. Through her targeting display, she could see her rounds impacting exactly where she had aimed them. The effect was immediate and devastating. The machine gun fire from the building ceased instantly, and she could see secondary explosions as her rounds detonated ammunition stored inside the structure. In less than 3 seconds of firing, she had eliminated a threat that had been pinning down an entire Marine platoon. Outstanding hit! Outstanding hit! Came the excited voice of the ground controller. Target neutralized. Marines are advancing. Sarah pulled up from her attack run, her hands slightly shaky from the adrenaline surge that followed her first combat engagement. She had just fired her weapons in anger for the first time, had taken lives in defense of others, and had proven herself capable of performing under the ultimate pressure. The mission continued for another 2 hours as Sarah and Major Thompson systematically eliminated the remaining enemy positions. Each attack required the same careful planning, precise execution, and constant awareness of the fragile line between protecting friendly forces and causing unintended casualties. When they finally returned to Bagram Airfield, Sarah felt a profound sense of exhaustion mixed with satisfaction. She had successfully completed her first combat mission, had proven herself worthy of the trust placed in her by the Marines who depended on her support, and had validated all the training and preparation that had brought her to this point. As she shut down her aircraft and climbed out of the cockpit, Sarah was met by her crew chief, Staff Sergeant Mike Rodriguez. no relation to the Lieutenant Rodriguez who had helped her at Davis-Monthan months earlier. The young enlisted man's face showed a mixture of professional pride and personal concern for the pilot he was responsible for maintaining. "How'd she fly, Captain?" Sergeant Rodriguez asked, referring to the aircraft rather than Sarah herself. "Like a dream, Sergeant. No problems at all. She brought me home safe and sound." The crew chief nodded with satisfaction and began his post-flight inspection, checking for battle damage and normal wear items that might need attention before the next mission. In a combat environment, the relationship between pilots and maintenance crews took on special significance. They were all part of a team whose effectiveness could mean the difference between life and death. Major Thompson appeared at Sarah's shoulder as she completed her post-flight paperwork. The senior pilot's expression showed approval mixed with the kind of professional assessment that never completely ceased in combat operations. "Good work today, Martinez. You handled yourself like a veteran pilot. The Marines were very happy with your performance, and that's the only evaluation that really matters in this business." Later that evening, Sarah sat in her quarters writing a letter home to her family. She found it difficult to explain the reality of combat operations, the mixture of boredom and terror, the awesome responsibility of carrying weapons capable of devastating destruction, and the profound satisfaction that came from knowing she had made a real difference in the outcome of a battle. As she wrote, Sarah thought about General Harrison and the challenge he had issued that day at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base. His dare had been the catalyst that changed her entire career trajectory, transforming her from a competent but unremarkable transport pilot into a combat aviator who was now saving lives and influencing the outcome of military operations. She wondered if the general had anticipated how far his casual challenge would lead, whether he had known that a single moment of audacity would result in her eventual deployment to a combat zone where she would put her life on the line for soldiers she had never met. The answer to that question would come 6 months later, when Sarah received a letter forwarded through military postal channels. The return address showed it was from General Harrison, now retired from active duty, but still following the careers of pilots whose potential he had recognized. "Captain Martinez," the letter read, "I've been following your progress through official channels and unofficial sources. Your squadron commander's reports indicate that you've become one of their most reliable and effective pilots, with a reputation for precision and professionalism that reflects well on yourself and the Air Force. I want you to know that I'm proud of what you've accomplished, but I'm not surprised. I saw something in you that day at Davis-Monthan that convinced me you had the potential to excel in combat aviation. What I didn't anticipate was how thoroughly you would prove me right. The dare I issued that day was calculated to push you beyond your comfort zone and force you to demonstrate capabilities that you might never have discovered through normal channels. Sometimes exceptional people need exceptional opportunities to reach their full potential. Continue to fly safe, serve with honor, and remember that you've earned your place among the elite community of combat aviators through skill, determination, and courage. The young transport pilot who accepted my challenge has become exactly what I hoped she would become, a warrior worthy of the aircraft she flies and the mission she serves." Sarah folded the letter carefully and placed it in her personal effects, alongside the other mementos she carried as reminders of the journey that had brought her to this point. Outside her quarters, she could hear the sound of A-10s returning from another mission, their distinctive engine noise a comforting reminder of the community she now belonged to. As she prepared for sleep, Sarah reflected on the unpredictable nature of military careers and the importance of being ready to seize opportunities when they arose. A single moment of courage, one decision to accept an impossible challenge, had changed everything for her. Tomorrow would bring another mission, another chance to prove herself worthy of the trust placed in her by the soldiers who depended on close air support for their survival. But tonight, Captain Sarah Martinez could rest knowing that she had successfully transformed herself from a dreamer into a warrior, from someone who studied combat aviation to someone who lived it every day. The general's dare had become her destiny, and She had proven herself worthy of both the challenge and the opportunity it had created.